This was the first and is the oldest public library in the English-speaking world. Chetham's library has been in continuous use as a public library for over 365 years. The sandstone building dates to 1421, built to accommodate a college of Christian priests. What was written here in the city centre of Manchester would change the political world forever, at least in this age. Unfortunately, because of the coronavirus, today it's closed, and in fact everything is shutting down, so I'm probably going to film shoots across the city centre and finish the rest of the series at home. In the previous video, we discovered the Victorian slums that surrounded the inner city of Manchester, and in particular Angel Meadow, the cruelest, disease-ridden, most violent slum in Britain. And one man would make the slums of Manchester famous throughout the world, and joining with a fellow German, a revolution. The eldest of 8 children, the young Friedrich Engels worked in the family business in Barmen near Dusseldorf, and Barmen was known as Little Manchester. They owned a cotton manufacturing business, but Manchester in northern England is where they set their sights. Manchester was leading the Industrial Revolution, and the Engels family wanted to cash in. Friedrich's father was engrossed in both business and church life, and Friedrich would push back against both. He had been a reluctant apprentice in management of the cotton industry, and it was his inquisitive nature about how the other half lived that caught his interest and fueled a new passion. Studying literature and wayward theologians, Friedrich resolved only to treat a teaching as divine if it can defend itself before the bar of reason. Rather than a disciple of Jesus, Friedrich declared himself a disciple of the Young German movement, a literary group whose members were radical in politics and very liberal in religion. He was also influenced by a group called the Young Hegelians in Berlin, who sought a new era free from Bible-believing Christianity, replaced by enterprise of helping humanity by means of true rationale, a rationale necessarily apart from Scripture. On the way home from Berlin, he stopped to meet with a Jew that would solidify his foundational thought, Moses Hess. Moses Hess was of the Young Hegelian movement, who would become known as the communist rabbi. He had published an article in a liberal newspaper, and Friedrich sought to meet him. Moses would later say that Engels was revolutionary to the core when he met me and left as a passionate communist. That same autumn in Cologne, Engels also met with the editor of the newspaper, Karl Marx. At first, they were suspicious of each other's affiliation, so they didn't hit it off, but this initial contact would develop into lifelong friends and colleagues. Aged 22, Engels came to Manchester in 1842 to work in the family's cotton mill located in Salford. And now an atheist, his relationship with his father would be a difficult one. His father thought that sending him to Manchester may make him reconsider some of his radical opinions, but instead it galvanized them. Friedrich, on the other hand, saw it as an opportunity to combine his style of business management with his passion for politics. Manchester, from Engels' perspective, was the city of the future in the country of the future. Yet he wouldn't be prepared for what he would witness here. The following year, Engels met 2 sisters, Mary and Lizzie Burns, who were factory girls and daughters of Irish immigrants who lived near Deansgate. Their father, Michael, was a dyer in a cotton mill, and these were tough girls, hard-working girls, certainly not a pushover, proud of their heritage and fiercely political. And they gave Friedrich Engels a tour of Manchester's dark side. And the 23-year-old Engels, he enjoyed their company so much he fell in love with Mary. And as an atheist, he didn't believe in the institution of marriage, though he lived with her on and off. Eleanor Marx, Karl's daughter, would later say that Mary was very pretty, witty, and altogether a charming girl, but in later years drank
to excess. Engels was appalled by the culture around drink in Manchester, and Engels described the slums as hell upon earth, recording that in some areas half of the children died before the age of 5. The slums in Manchester were his fuel and red flag behind his ideas, and he began writing a book titled The Condition of the Working Class in England. By the summer of 1844, Engels had compiled most of his book. On the way home from Manchester, he met with Karl Marx for the second time in Paris, where he now lived and worked as an editor. And Engels presented to Marx his findings and would later say that we found ourselves in complete agreement on questions of theory, and our collaboration began at that time. Marx listened to Engels' notion that it would be the working class who would be the instrument of the final revolution. And Marx suggested they write together on superior philosophy and political economy. Together they wrote The Holy Family, a critique of the Young Hegelians and a sarcastic reference to the Bauer brothers, Marx's former friends. And because of Marx's increasingly radical, publicly expressed views, he became politically exiled in Brussels with other socialists such as Moses Hess. Engels would join him temporarily with his partner Mary. And in 1845, Engels gave Marx a guided trip to England. Marx was keen to examine the economic resources available for study in Manchester and London libraries. By 1845, you can feel the tension between Friedrich and both his biological father and the Heavenly Father. Writing to Marx, he says, "All of the religious fanaticism of my old man has been aroused by the communist meetings. The old man's wrath has been increased by my firm refusal to go into petty trading. You can have no notion of the sheer malice that lies behind this wild Christian hunt after my soul." How much of Friedrich's pushback was based upon his compassion for the working class, and to what degree it was based upon his revulsion to the Christian faith, will leave me mused. Is it a classic case of the son who rebels against his father's faith, and a vibrant crowd demanding his voice being the way out? I can hear the scoffers. Either way, foundational to him was God out of the picture. The answer to the working class was godless classrooms and godless academia, secular science and reason with a future. In June 1845, he published his book in Germany, and this book was predominantly researched and written in Manchester, and it became the foundational document of what would become the Marxian socialist tradition. And he also wrote an English preface printed separately to the members of the British Parliament. And this is what he said: "I accuse the English bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, before the entire world of murder, robbery, and other crimes on a massive scale." Quite the indictment. He said the Industrial Revolution created polarizing divisions in the classes and chaotic urbanization. He draws attention to the competition that is driven by modern society as a battle of all against all. I do hope he read the atheistic version of Creation on the Origin of Species, which would be published 14 years later. But anyway, he wrote about London and other cities, but his focus was on his new hometown of Manchester. He spoke about the geographical situation, the transport system, the class apartheid, and of course the slums. He attacked the greed and the abuse of the mill owners. He saw communism as the healing doctrine which could transcend class struggle, though he does admit that the war between the rich and the poor would be a perpetual bloody one. Critics would say Engels didn't give any credit to the middle class, who had drive and vitality, and some had sterling character and purpose. They also said that his picture of pre-industrialised Britain was an overly idyllic one. What he did do was put the horror stories of people's lives on paper. And the spread of socialism meant his book was later published in the United States in 1887, and then the same translation published in Britain in 1892. Manchester authorities reacted to the book by sending out nightmen who emptied the 30,000 ash pits within a year. And apparently some of the human waste was like concrete that had to be smashed up with axes. It didn't prevent the diseases from prevailing though. Karl Marx was German, but also ethnically Jewish. Both his grandfathers were rabbis. He was from an upper middle class family. His father, Heinrich Marx, was an attorney and an owner of vineyards. Heinrich Marx was born with the Yiddish name Herschel Levi to his father, Rabbi Marx Levi Mordecai. Herschel, or Heinrich, went from practicing Judaism to joining the Evangelical Church of Prussia. Born in an age when Jews were treated with inferior legal and social status, he became a casual student of the Enlightenment and liberal rationale. Karl, the third of 9 children, became the eldest when his older siblings passed away, and all remaining children, including Marx, were baptized in the Lutheran Church in August 1824, and their mother would be baptized the following year. Like Engels, did Marx push back from his father's Christian faith, and perhaps even further from his grandfather's faith? Would his father's stories of discriminatory laws applied specifically against the Jews affect the young mind of Marx? He attended Trier High School, which included many humanist teachers. In fact, during Karl's years there, the school was raided by the police for distributing literature espousing political liberalism. Karl wished to go on and study philosophy and literature, but his father insisted on law being more practical. After sending Karl to the University of Bonn, Heinrich was disappointed by his poor grades, and even after sending him to the University of Berlin, his father would admonish him for his excessive drinking, his disorderly conduct, his refusal of all conventions, his meandering into all kinds of fields of study, his disrespect shown to his father, and beyond extravagant spending. Apparently he was splashing more cash around than the exceedingly wealthy. Heinrich said his son brought no fruit of happiness to his family back home. His father would weep bitterly over his son Karl. Now, having said that, Karl did have a deep affection for his father and would carry a photo of his father on him at all times after his death. The more I look at the life of Karl Marx, the more I wonder about the inner turmoil that played out in his mind. Now, why am I telling you these things? These men aren't from Manchester. They aren't even English. Because it's important to build an image of who these men were that we imported to Manchester so that we can understand what they exported from Manchester to the world. Stick with me. Like Engels, Karl was attracted to the radical liberal thinking groups such as the Young Hegelians. After writing fiction and non-fiction with Bruno Bauer, he co-edited Hegel's Philosophy of Religion, and in 1841 for his doctrinal thesis he asserted theology must yield to the superior wisdom of philosophy. Marx was now a confirmed atheist and planned to start a journal with Bruno Bauer called Atheistic Archives, though it never saw the light of day. Marx and Bauer apparently took a trip to Bonn where they got drunk, and when visiting a church they laughed and mocked in the service. Karl hadn't forgotten his Jewish roots, publishing the essay On the Jewish Question, which criticises Hegel and Bauer, who saw no place for religion and specifically Judaism in secular society. Now, at first glance it appears an apologetic of Judaism, but more than a skim read reveals his heart. Karl's naturalistic view of Judaism was a secular, practical, worldly one that's practices were expressions of fiscal achievement and parochial thinking. He said that Christians have become Jews and proposed mankind be set free from this practical Judaism. One British scholar suggested that Marx had now developed anti-Semitic views embarrassed by his Jewish background and used the Jews as a yardstick of evil. Another scholar described the essay as one of the classics of anti-Semitic propaganda. Marx equated money-making with Jewish identity. Marx considered Jews to be the embodiment of capitalism and the representation of all its evils. This was the man that moved to Manchester and yoked himself to Engels. Two men pushing back from their Judeo-Christian faith, even authority I would say, heavily influenced by Hegel and the left-wing Hegelians who pushed atheistic religion, if any, almost ashamed of their ethnic identity or social status, rightly shocked by the conditions of some of the working class, but looking in the wrong direction for a quick fix solution.
This library includes 60,000 books that were published before 1851, the perfect location for Engels and Marx to study. The backdrop being the mill workers and the slums such as Angel Meadow, just a 10-minute walk away from here.
Commissioned by the Communist League, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx set about writing. Their desk in the library is still intact today.
Just next door to Manchester Cathedral, this is what they produced in Chetham's library. The Communist Manifesto was largely written here in central Manchester.
Originally titled Manifesto of the Communist Party, they published in London in 1848. It was a programme of action for the Communist League. Once a secret society, it would now tell the world its ideas and ride the wave of the revolutions of 1848. The opening lines of the pamphlet set forth the principal basis of what became known as Marxism. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. It features their ideas for how the capitalist society of their time would eventually be replaced by socialism and then eventually communism. They asserted that it was their political party above the other liberal groups that was truly acting in the interests of the working class to overthrow capitalist society and replace it with socialism. It is recognised as one of the most influential political documents of all time. Marxism is said to be based in large part on three influences: Hegel's dialects, French utopian socialism, and English economics. Later that year, Europe saw violent protests and rebellion against authority. The monarchy in France was overthrown and the French Second Republic was established. Marx supported these revolutions and allegedly used a third of his inheritance to arm workers planning a revolution. The conflict between Marxism and Christianity has been well documented. Marx eventually moved to London in 1849 and with him the headquarters of the Communist League. In political exile, he would be based there for the rest of his life. In the first few years in London, he lived with his family in extreme poverty because Marx worked exclusively on his revolutionary activities. Only 3 of his 7 children survived to adulthood, partly because of the poor conditions they lived. Engels was funding him, but then Engels' cash ran out as well because he was being fed by his father. Engels and Marx then set themselves up as international journalists. 20 years after the publication of Friedrich's book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, Marx wrote to Engels, and this is what he said: "I have read your book again. Those were the days when you made the reader feel that your theory would become fact. If not tomorrow, then at any rate on the day after. Yet the very illusion gave the whole work a human warmth and a touch of humour that make our later writings, where black and white have become grey and grey, seem positively distasteful." Before he died, Karl asked Friedrich to finish writing up his ideas, including his volumes Das Kapital and his book The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. On Karl's death, Friedrich laid the photograph of his father in his coffin. He would be reburied in London with his family in 1954. His tombstone bears the carved message, "Workers of all lands unite," the final line of the Communist Manifesto. Monuments to Marx would be erected throughout the world. Frustrated in their own careers and with observations of how the other half lived, they sought to mobilise the working class, though helping people was necessarily separate from God. Today, Manchester is firmly in the hands of the Socialist Labour Party, who are currently led by entrenched Marxists. In fact, we used to have what we call in the north of England the Red Wall, where the Labour Party ruled from coast to coast. That was until recently when the Brexit-focused elections smashed a hole through it. The suggestion that Jesus was a socialist is ridiculous. What was sown here in Manchester has a grip on the body of the church here. Many churches hold to a socialistic framework. In fact, it's hard to find one that doesn't. Doctrines of politics can be a complicated subject. No government is perfect before the Lord's return. But if we're not careful, the gospel can morph into the pseudo-social gospel, aligning with the human rights movement and equality movement and away from God's order of things. Government is a covering and a blessing even in a deformed state, but we should never wish for government control to expand under socialism inch by inch until it takes over all of life. The government is not our saviour. I've thoroughly enjoyed Dennis Prager's commentaries on the Bible, and as a Jew, he has much to say about communism. Listen to this. When people describe particularly evil individuals or regimes, why is it that they use the terms Nazi or fascist, but almost never communist? Given the unparalleled amount of human suffering communists have caused, why is communist so much less of a term of revulsion than Nazi? Communists killed 70 million people in China, more than 20 million people in the Soviet Union, not including 5 million Ukrainians, and almost 1 out of every 3 Cambodians. And communists enslaved entire nations in Russia, Vietnam, China, Eastern Europe, North Korea, Cuba, and much of Central Asia. They ruined the lives of well over 1 billion people.
This building in Manchester that was built to house priests became the birthplace of an Antichrist political movement.